All right, everyone. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Today we're going to be continuing the clarifying and speaking about the different evolution of Muslim thinking, and we talked about the different madhab before. We talked about the Hanafi madhab. We talked about the different points throughout history that led to the existence of those four madhab. We mentioned some of the most important things in history. We talked about some of those maps in terms of the Muslim thinking and what they evolved in, and we talked about their presence in different parts of the world, and we also talked about the different sides of the different madhab. We talked about the expansion of the different madhab, and we did clarify slightly between the Sunni and the Shia. We talked about the Hanafi madhab and the details of that, and today inshallah we're going to talk about the Maliki madhab. For the Maliki madhab, of course, the scholar Malik ibn Anas. Malik ibn Anas, he was originally from Yemen and lived in Medina. And in fact did not leave Medina except once for Hajj. He is originally from Yemen, from Himyar, the tribes that were originally from Himyar. He was born in 93 Hijrah, and which is really important to keep in mind, because since he was born in 93 Hijrah, that gives us an idea. In terms of how far he is from the Prophet ﷺ. Remember, the Prophet ﷺ died in 11-year Hijrah, and so therefore we're looking at, some almost 2 generations between him and the Prophet ﷺ. Malik ibn Anas died in 179 Hijriya, and his main teachers were Abdurrahman ibn Hurmuz, Muhammad ibn Muslim, ibn Shihab al-Zuhri. Now, Zuhri, I want you to keep an eye on Zuhri, because he is actually one of the most important scholars that learned from the Sahaba. He was a tabi'i, learned from the Sahaba directly, and was one of the most important scholars for Malik ibn Anas. In fact, in most of the narrations you will find, especially in al-Muwatta, you will find Ibn Shihab al-Zuhri and Ibn Dhakwan, and also Ja'far ibn Muhammad al-Baqir. And this is really important because Ja'far ibn Muhammad al-Baqir happens to be one of the figures that Shias regard as holy, let's use that term, because he is from Ahlul Bayt. He used to teach at the masjid until he became sick with urinary incontinence. And this is really important because that illness was a main challenge that made him not go to the masjid often. And he would have his he would have his classes very different from Imam Abu Hanifa, because Imam Abu Hanifa, his classes were pretty much like a debate, sort of, where there's a discussion, there's a matter in fiqh that is put forward, and they would discuss the different sides to it. Versus Imam Malik ibn Anas was very different. His classes did not involve any of that discussion. He would just give the hadith, comment on the fiqh of it, and second hadith, third hadith, and that was basically it. So you didn't see any of what was happening at the majlis, at the setting in Abu Hanifa's classes. The urinary incontinence was a very big deal. Now, here's one thing, is that subhanAllah, with different scholars, so you had different illnesses that different scholars face. So Imam Malik was facing this urinary incontinence, versus Imam Shafi'i was extremely ill with hemorrhoids. In fact, he would even sit on a pillow because of all the bleeding. He would get up and there would be lots of bleeding on the pillow because of the hemorrhoids. Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal had shaqiqa, which is migraines. He had severe migraines, but subhanallah, they still wanted to get to the most important part, which is to get to Jannah and to get to that ilm. Like I said, his classes, Malik ibn Anas, were free from discussion and only had lectures in hadith. And when we speak of Imam Malik ibn Anas, it's really important to talk about the sources. The resources that he went to were, number one, Quran was the first resource, Sunnah, Ijma', and we talked about the Ijma', which is the scholars' consensus. And he also considered that the people of Medina, that they themselves were that transmission, that they were this accumulative, gathered oral transmission and practical transmission for the Sunnah, and especially that in Medina, which is where the Prophet ﷺ was, there was still a large majority of the second generation, which are the Tabi'in, that were living in Medina, that still had some, that culture. It's a numerous number. It's a large number of people that were still living in Medina, and they were still not very far away from the time of the Prophet ﷺ. So he considered that the people of Medina, that they themselves and their actions are a valid resource, and considered that it was even to be considered as a resource even before Qiyas. Qiyas, on the other hand, which is that analogy, we talked about it before, in the companions' reports he regarded were extremely important, and even before any other type of analogy or even any type of putting in that ra'i. And remember, when we said ra'i, opinion, we did talk about opinion, and we said that when we talk of opinion, it doesn't mean a personal opinion where this is what I think, but it was an opinion that is based on looking through the lens of the maqasid al-sharia, the sharia maxims in Islam, and then looking through that those lenses, in which is the principles of Islam and maqasid al-sharia, and finally coming out with an Islamic report on that, based on the different information that we can gather from the Quran, Sunnah, Ijma', Islamic principles, etc. Now, he did also consider Sadd al-Dhara'i' al-'Urf and al-Maslaha al-Mursala. This is really important to mention, because all scholars, in fact for the Maliki, they regarded that Sadd al-Dhara'i', which is closing the means that lead to evil, considered it as 2/3 of Sharia. 2/3 of Sharia, and the most important scholar to speak about regulating Sadd al-Dhara'i', which is the blocking the means of evil, considered that in itself was actually the main, being the main source. Ash-Shatibi, a very important Maliki scholar, redefined in many ways Sadd al-Dhara'i', which is a very important resource, and laid out whether something leads to haram often, very many times, usually, etc., and actually had in his al-Muwafaqat, very important resource to review that. You can, there are PhD dissertations that are just written on Ash-Shatibi and Sadd al-Dhara'i', just to clarify that. The other part, which when we speak about Imam Malik today, al-Maliki madhab in the world, it's famous in North Africa. So we're looking at Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco, Mauritania, Senegal, Mali, parts of in the southern parts of Egypt are pretty much Maliki scholars, or Maliki in their madhab. The Maliki madhab today is actually going through a magnificent revival. There was a stage of that subtle stage where things were pretty much calmed down, because it needed lots of support. There was the Maliki madhab was going through a stage of that subtle stage where it was really quiet. The scholars were just really hidden, very small groups, and it was really slow in its growth, and the Hanbali madhab during our contemporary times was really going through that more that growth, let me call it that way, and that was because Al Hanbali madhab was promoted through Saudi Arabia, pretty much Al Khalij, the Gulf countries, etc. But right now, the Maliki madhab is witnessing a magnificent revival during our times, and you have some of the most important scholars. There were different political reasons, but some of the most important scholars is Sa'id al-Kamali. Sa'id al-Kamali is one of the most important, prominent Maliki scholars. You listen to that scholars, you've got all these YouTube videos on Imam Sa'id al-Kamali. You would really feel like you're listening to a scholar not from our day and age. You feel like you're listening to a scholar that all of a sudden, it's the memory that he has, the ilm that he has, the shi'r, the poetry, the istihdar, like istihdar, and remembering all those different texts. It's almost magnificent and almost unbelievable to be seen during our day and age. He's about 45-year-old man, but amazing. Most of the lectures that I'm listening are really for Sa'id al-Kamali. Amazing. It's almost unbelievable. And of course, with the Maliki scholars, the main Maliki scholars that spread the madhab Maliki were number one, Abdurrahman ibn al-Qasim, Abdullah ibn Wahb, Abu al-Hasan al-Qurtubi, Asad ibn al-Farat, and who even learned from Abu Yusuf Muhammad ibn al-Hasan al-Shaybani. Really important to speak about Asad ibn al-Farat, because Asad ibn al-Farat even learned from Bilad al-Sham, in the Levant, and even learned the Maliki and the Shafi'i madhab, the Hanafi and Shafi'i madhab. So you could see Asad ibn al-Furat, and his own daughter was actually a main scholar as well. Asad ibn al-Furat learned from Abu Yusuf and Muhammad ibn Hassan al-Shaybani. These two names, we had talked about them before as being the most important figures. Without these two figures, Abu Yusuf, Yaqub ibn Ibrahim, and Abu Yusuf is Yaqub ibn Ibrahim. Abu Yusuf and Muhammad ibn al-Hasan al-Shaybani were the most important two figures. Without them, there would probably be no Hanafi madhab. Those are the most important two figures to teach and spread al-Hanafi madhab. And Asad ibn al-Furat was actually in direct contact, in fact, was one of the students who learned from the direct students of Abu Hanifa, al-Hanafi madhab. This is really important because when we speak about what happened later on and all the divisions that later happened between the madhab, we will see that the sad story is that most of the students are unaware of the wisdom and even the history of how those madhab came about. You could see how they learned from one another. Let's go for Shafi'i, one of my most favorite scholars. Imam al-Shafi'i. Imam al-Shafi'i was actually Muhammad ibn Idris al-Shafi'i. He was born in Gaza in Palestine. And his mother, when his father died, when he was still at the age of 2, his mother decided to take him to Mecca back again, where his paternal relatives had lived, and there he learned from the scholars in Mecca. He was just a young boy, but when he was a little child, his mother would send him off to the suburbs, and in the suburbs, remember the story of the Prophet ﷺ with Halima Sa'diyah? That's the same thing that they used to do. The culture was still prevalent at the time for Shafi'i during his time, even though Shafi'i was born 150-year Hijrah, but his mother sent him off to the tribe of Bani Hudayl. Right? So the tribe of Bani Hudayl, which were considered, living in the suburbs, very Bedouin style, but it was still considered a major place for for anybody to learn Arabi that was very classical. And Al-Shafi'i himself, at the age of 7, had memorized the Quran and also learned classical Lugha Arabiya from the tribe of Bani Hudayl. Al-Asma'i, a very important scholar later on, said, I had corrected the poetry of Bani Hudayl from a fatan min Quraysh, from a fata, from a young lad, from a young boy from Quraysh. Now, Shafi'i was from Quraysh. He was originally Qurashi. And he said, or that is Al-Asma'i, said that I basically corrected the shi'r and reviewed the shi'r, the poetry of Bani Hudayl from a young boy of Quraysh. His name is Muhammad ibn Idris al-Shafi'i. Muhammad ibn Idris al-Shafi'i learned from Muslim ibn Khalid al-Zanji, the Mufti of Mecca then. So that was his most important sheikh, but it isn't until Imam al-Shafi'i, when the scholars had seen that Imam al-Shafi'i at the age of 9 was already beyond all the scholars from Mecca, it was time for Imam al-Shafi'i from the age of 9 to graduate from all the schools that were in Mecca, and it was a special scholarship that he got through the Wali. Al-Wali was the minister of Mecca, and then he would send him off to Medina. And in Medina, that's where at the age of 9, Imam al-Shafi'i meets Imam Malik for the first time, even though Imam Malik had very strict conditions on who would join the classes. But because Imam al-Shafi'i had already gotten a special scholarship and a special tawsiyah, recommendations, and it was a letter of recommendation from the scholars of Mecca sent to the minister of Mecca, to all the way to the minister of Medina, and then the minister of Medina would go to Imam Malik and speak about the letters of recommendations that were sent in order to let Imam al-Shafi'i join Imam Malik's class. Not everybody was able to join Imam Malik's class. It was only specific and very well qualified students that were able to join, and Imam al-Shafi'i was only 9 years old. But there was a condition before he would be able to join Imam Malik's class, and that was he had to memorize Al-Muwatta. The book Al-Muwatta, which is approximately 700-800 pages, full of ahadith and athar. Imam al-Shafi'i memorized that in 9 days. It's almost, I can't even read the book, out of just looking at it in 9 days. But subhanAllah, you're talking about as if it's a scanner where he was able to read. In fact, it was said that he would look at the page and cover the other page in order to not memorize one page before the other. Later, after finishing Shafi'i, after finishing to learn from Imam Malik in Medina, then he went to Yemen and learned from Umar ibn Abi Salama and Al-Awza'i. So he later learned from the scholars there, but then there was some kind of a plot against Imam al-Shafi'i, and it was sent on to the Khalifa at the time, and it was said that he was trying to cause a revolution against the Khalifa. So the Khalifa ordered that he would be brought all the way to Baghdad, which was the capital of the Khilafah at the time, and he was brought chained from Yemen all the way to Baghdad, chained in the heat, and there the Khalifa discovers that it was just a plot against the Imam al-Shafi'i, lets him loose, and the Imam al-Shafi'i then learns. Imam al-Shafi'i then goes to study under under Muhammad ibn Hassan al-Shaybani. There's the name again. Remember, we talked about Muhammad ibn Hassan al-Shaybani, and we said if it wasn't Muhammad ibn Hassan al-Shaybani, there would be no Hanafi madhab. Here's the name again. Muhammad ibn Hassan al-Shaybani becomes the direct student for Imam al-Shafi'i, and later he meets many scholars during Hajj, and finally he goes to Egypt, which is, his final stay. And it is really important to mention that Imam al-Shafi'i had a madhab. So first it was madhab Maliki, was learning from him. And then later he had his own madhab. And that madhab he corrected and evaluated a number of different things and re-evaluated, remodified a lot of the different madhab when he was in Baghdad. But then when he went to Egypt, he met with a very important scholar, and his name was Al-Layth ibn Sa'd. Al-Layth ibn Sa'd. Al-Layth ibn Sa'd, we are told that he was even more scholarly than Imam Malik. Well, he meets Al-Layth ibn Sa'd, which actually affects Imam al-Shafi'i, and later Imam al-Shafi'i was to again modify a lot of his madhab, and it was considered al-madhab al-jadid. So Imam al-Shafi'i had an old madhab, and later, that was when he was in Baghdad, and later he edits and modifies that madhab, and later it becomes al-madhab, the new madhab that Imam al-Shafi'i is known for. And Imam al-Shafi'i stays in Egypt, which is where he had died. Imam al-Shafi'i, like we said, had an old madhab in his book al-Hujjah, and then when he moved to Egypt, he updated it and had a new madhab. So his sources, you could see the different sources that Imam al-Shafi'i had. Number one, that there was Al-Quran, Sunnah, Ijma' and Qiyas. So the resources that he depended on, just like, this is really important to mention, because you could see that the resources that he used were pretty much the same exact resources that Imam Hanafi used, Abu Hanifa used, Imam Malik used, which is the Quran, Sunnah, Ijma' and the companions' reports. When we say companions' reports, those are known as Al-Athar or Qawl al-Sahabi. الآثار أو قول الصحابي. الآثار or قول الصحابي are pretty much the resources that were gathered from the different scholars that worked also on a hadith, and of course the al-Khulafa and also al-Qiyas. Now it's really important to mention when we speak about Imam al-Shafi'i. When we speak about Imam al-Shafi'i, it's really important to mention that there are resources that are considered as the references. Now, when you study a madhab, you can't study a madhab without going to their resources. It is very often, especially if you're doing a master's or a PhD dissertation, and if you say, for example, well, Shafi'iyya said such and such, and you go to Fath al-Qadir for Marghaynani, and you say, well, this is my reference, but they'll tell you, wait a minute, that's actually a Hanafi madhab. You can't use that Hanafi madhab to resource and quote something that you are saying is from the Shafi'i madhab. You need to go to the Shafi'i madhab books to quote a Shafi'i madhab. You need to go to a Hanafi book in order to say this is what the Hanafis are saying. And this is really important. So when you look at this right here, this little graph, you could see the most important books on al-Madhab al-Shafi'i. The most famous one is Al-All right, that was the first book that I bought in al-Madhab al-Shafi'i when I was in 9th grade. So approximately 15 years old. That was the first book that I bought, al-Shafi'i. And I must admit, when I bought that book and when I was 15 years old, the book was 5 volumes. It was a huge book. I still remember it till the time of today. It was a huge book, and I thought he was going to talk about mother, but it had nothing to do with speaking about mother or mothers or parents. It was actually talking about the fiqh, which every fiqh book would start out Kitab al-Tahara, the chapter on purification, and then Kitab al-Salah, and then would go Kitab al-Zakah, Kitab al-Siyam, al-Hajj, etc. And then it would go for al-Muamalat, then it would go for transactions, then it would go for family law, and then it would go for al-Qada, and then criminal law, etc. So that's exactly what you would find. Now you could see those are, you might say, well, what are these arrows? So those are the different shuruh, those are the different explanations, the different books that had explained or detailed and put details on these books. So for example, Mukhtasar al-Muzani would explain the book al-Umm, even though the book al-Umm is actually part, right now it's actually sold as part of Mukhtasar al-Muzani. And you would say, now you would see Minhaj al-Talibin would actually explain al-Muharrar and al-Wajiz and etc. And then the most important two scholars that will explain al-Shafi'i. So when al-Shafi'iyya would say the Shaykhain said, what they mean by that is al-Nawawi and al-Rafi'i. Al-Nawawi and al-Rafi'i. You could see that Nawawi had actually explained a number, and Nawawi is actually very Shafi'i and is considered one of the most important. In fact, if there was differences of opinions between al-Rafi'i and al-Shafi'i on what is the Shafi'i madhab really saying, they would consider Nawawi. So Nawawi, very Shafi'i, and you could see those. Now, right now, the different books, the most important books, you could see Minhaj al-Talibin, Rawdat al-Talibin for the Shafi'i madhab, and you would also look at Mughni al-Muhtaj, al-Khatib al-Sharbini, and those are the most important books. Now, for the students of ilm, Kifayat al-Akhyar, this is the book that I learned al-Madhab al-Shafi'i on, would go Kifayat al-Akhyar, and also al-Iqna'. So most, like right now, the students of ilm, the young students, when they learn for al-Madhab al-Shafi'i, they would make them study Kifayat al-Akhyar and al-Iqna'. Those are the most important two books for the students. They'll make them study. For the Hanafi madhab, it would be the book al-Ikhtiyar for the Hanafi madhab. So for the Maliki madhab, it would usually, forgot what Maliki madhab would usually be, the book. Let's see if I can see it here to show it to you. But al-Maliki madhab, there's actually a number of books for al-Maliki madhab, but the most important book that you can go for al-Maliki madhab is usually for التذكرة and the Ibn Abd al-Bar's books. So those are usually the references that they would go back to. Now let's go ahead with the other part, which is you could see the different books of Shafi'iyya. I know this looks like confusing, but for anybody that is studying al-Madhab al-Shafi'i, these are considered really important. They would have to look at all these scholars and all these books and these references, and you could see that Mukhtasar al-Muzani, which is Mukhtasar from the book al-Umm, which is the book, the mother, al-Umm, and you could see that there would be Ta'liqat, there would be al-Hawi al-Kabir, and al-Shamil al-Lubab, etc. Those would be the references that you would go back to, and here, those books would be an explanation of the main books. But the most important book is really Mukhtasar al-Muzani, which summarized the book al-Umm for al-Shafi'i, the book al-Umm lil-Shafi'i. So just keep that in mind, that when somebody wants to study a madhab, it's not just an easy thing where, I said this or such a scholar said this. There are resources to go back to. Just looking at these and just imagining, like Nihayat al-Muhtaj, Mughni al-Muhtaj, Tuhfat al-Muhtaj, all these books. Each one is almost, this one's 7 volumes, this is almost 8 volumes, and all these. Some of these books are actually missing, by the way, but they're Okay, so let's move on. The madhab al-Shafi'i, al-madhab al-Shafi'i, um, it's recommended that Al-Albani, one of the most important scholars, recommended that that in for talabat al-ilm, for the students of ilm, that they would start with al-madhab al-Shafi'i to study from. And today it's spread in Indonesia, Malaysia, and Egypt. In Egypt, there are also madhab Shafi'i in at least the northern part. And Malaysia and Indonesia are pretty much so. You're talking about Indonesia, 250 million. Malaysia, also madhab Shafi'i. Madhab Shafi'i, Somalis are generally madhab Shafi'i. That doesn't mean that all the scholars of al madhab Shafi'i that all Somalis are Shafi'i, because you do have, historically speaking, there were some areas that did study and in fact were scholars in al-madhab al-Hanafi. Al-madhab al-Hanbali in the Somali community did not come till later on, during the 60s. That's when the madhab Hanbali started coming in. But the madhab Hanafi, a city in Somalia called Zayla. There were a number of great scholars from the Hanafi madhab, and the most important Hanafi madhab scholar from Somalia, his name is Zayla'i. He was attributed to Zayla, or Zayla'i. He wrote the book Nasb al-Raya fi takhrij ahadith al-Hidayah. And that book is one of the most important books of hadith in madhab Hanafi. But it doesn't mean that all Somalis, like I said, are necessarily Shafi'i. There are right now a number of madhab Hanbali that came with Salafism. All right, so let's look at the new madhab. You could see Imam Musnad al-Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal. Look at that beautiful picture right there. So you can see Musnad al-Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal. All right, this is the Musnad. Now the Musnad, Ahmad ibn Hanbal, guess what? This is not the book that Ahmad ibn Hanbal himself wrote. All right, this book, Ahmad ibn Hanbal did not write this book. See how huge it is? Imagine. By the way, yes, you could see it. It's almost 44 volumes. Almost 44 volumes. Yeah, the original copy is in about 5 volumes, but later Shu'aib al-Arnaut, a scholar originally from Albania, but lived in Syria, was the most important scholar, along with two other scholars that actually did tahqiq. And what tahqiq is, they basically would review all the hadith and review all the narrators and would comment on whether this hadith is authentic or not. Imagine, you guys. Now, Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal did not write this book. It was actually his son. His son was the one that wrote the book, and after his father's death. So that's why when you go to Musnad Ahmad ibn Hanbal, it would always say قال Abu Abdullah حدثنا such and such. He would always say قال Abu Abdullah or حدثنا Abu Abdullah, and in that he means his own father. So his father, which is Ahmad ibn Hanbal, was actually the scholar of hadith. He was a scholar of hadith, and that's why some scholars did not regard, at least historically speaking in the earlier times, madhab al-Hanbali was not a fiqh madhab. It started out as a hadith scholar, and Ahmad ibn Hanbal was more of a hadith scholar than a fiqh scholar, and which is why in the Hanbali madhab, you will find more than one opinion in that madhab. So the Hanbali madhab, there will be maybe 12 and maybe 19 different opinions on the Hanbali madhab. And that's why they would have to go back to the book. It's called Al-Insaf fi Ma'rifat al-Rajih min al-Khilaf. They would have to go back for al-Mirdawi and actually see what is the known Hanbali madhab regarding that rule. So the Hanbali madhab, generally, they've got different resources that they go back to. And of course, number one is the Quran and Sunnah. And then the companions fatwa. They are pretty much, the Hanbali madhab is very strict to avoiding using opinion, and specifically be specific in choosing the hadith and the text, or even the sahabas narration, and even if it is a weak hadith, but not very weak. So when we say weak hadith, it's called mursal. So that doesn't mean a fabricated hadith. All right, this is really important, because I don't want, especially right now, we're getting people, not really knowing what Islam says, and they would think, well, here, these people are using fabricated hadith. It's not, no. Hanbali madhab, or the Hanabila, are the most strict people on making sure that no hadith is fabricated. So no, they will not use a fabricated hadith. So just please don't misunderstand that one. When we say hadith da'if, in that they mean al hadith al mursal. What does it mean, al hadith al mursal? Al hadith al mursal is when a scholar of hadith might actually mention a narration, but the narration is not complete. The narration, I'm talking about the chain of narration, not the wording. The chain of narration. So, for example, one tabi'i will say, on Ibn Abbas, even though he didn't really see Ibn Abbas, and he will actually mention it, or say about the Prophet ﷺ, or quote a hadith without saying who he got the narration or the hadith from. So then he will pretty much take away a large portion of those scholars in the chain of narration. So that's what they regard as mursal. All right. And the mursal, scholars have different opinions on taking from those types of hadith, and Shafi'i has his own fatwa or madhab on that. But regardless, al-madhab al-hanbali is very strict in considering the text over al-ra'i, over opinion, and al-ra'i to mean al-ijtihad. Ra'i is to mean al-ijtihad. Let me just here, sorry, design. Let me just make sure we use a different design. Okay, here we go. All right, so now, sorry about that, but okay. All right, so let's move on. And okay, here we go. Where was I? Oh no, sorry, sometimes it's when you've got different screens. Okay, so the first madhab, the first and most concern, of course, for the Hanbali is really to use the hadith and sunnah. Let's really go back to the hadith and sunnah. His students, of course, sorry, here we go. The main scholars that spread the madhab al-Hanbali were really Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn al-Qayyim. These are the most important two scholars, and later on we're going to see later, we would hear a lot about Wahhabism and all that. So these are the most important modern, I would say, groups or political group right now that is Hanbali. And we're going to just see a little bit later on what does it mean, Wahhabism. So am I Wahhabi? What is Wahhabi? And many times people just confuse those terms. So we're going to talk about that later on. The main students and scholars. So al-Mirwazi was not actually a direct student, but that was later on. And Abu Bakr al-Khalal, al-Khiraqi, those were not direct students for Ahmad ibn Hanbal. Those were later scholars that were important figures. Neither was Ibn Taymiyyah. In fact, Ibn Taymiyyah died 728 Hijriya. That was, and of course we know that Ahmad ibn Hanbal died 264 Hijriya. So that's almost 400 years difference. All right. So a number of other things to discuss is basically the books that they go back to. Now you could see right there, Madhab Hanbali, Mukhtasar al-Khiraqi. That's the most important. That's one of my favorite books for Madhab al-Hanbali, really. Al-Mughni. It's the easiest one to go back to. Al-Mughni. Yes, it's almost eight, depending on the print. 8 volumes, 8 huge volumes. That's the most important book. But then you have to go back in order to study al-Madhab al-Hanbali. You also need al-Insaf al-Mirdawi. The reason why you need al-Insaf al-Mirdawi is because the Madhab Hanbali oftentimes has more than one opinion on one matter. Like I said, it can go up to 19 different opinions for a talib al-ilm that is not specialized for, or even if you are specialized, to learn al-madhab al-hanbali. You need to make sure that you're getting all those different opinions in just the Hanbali madhab lined out in order for you to see. The other important book is Manar al-Sabil. Manar al-Sabil, this book is, it's printed, and Manar al-Sabil, it's actually the most famous book for students of ilm. And of course, Manar al-Sabil, when we're looking at Manar al-Sabil, Bulugh al-Maram, and all those are actually important books to go back to study al-Hanbali madhab. The students usually, Rawd al-Murbi' is usually the students, when they teach them, when they are taught the Hanbali madhab, it's usually this book that they go back to. It's almost 2 huge volumes, and sometimes in 4 volumes. So this is the book that they go back to. A very important book if you just want a book to go back to in order to study al-Hanbali madhab. If you just you buy al-Mughni, although al-Mughni, this book is not only specific for al-Hanbali madhab, but it is more like al-Fiqh al-Muqaran, where they will put in all the different opinions and compare the different evidences that the different madhahib also use. So the book al-Mughni. My personal favorite is Kitab al-Mughni. Al-Mughni, this is Sharh Mukhtasar al-Khiraqi. This is a very important reference that I would always go back to in order to study al-Mughni and al-Insaf, in order to study al-Madhab al-Hanbali. Kashaf al-Qina' is also a very important book. It's almost in 10 volumes to go back to. Now let's just look at the Muslim distribution. Of course, we've got, although this is not 100% accurate, just to note, this is, an approximate thing, because you could see that, there's al-Ibadiyya that they took out, and just different things. So you could see that al-Hanafi madhab is by far the most expansive madhab. Hanbali is pretty much in this area. Maliki, you've got some Malikiya. Ironically, you've got some Malikiya here, which is the North African part. We mentioned Mauritania, Morocco, Algeria, mentioned those areas, and you also have some Malikiya in al-Bahrain. That's why Sa'id al-Kamali is often invited to al-Bahrain, because you got a number of Maliki scholars there. And the Shafi'i madhab, look at the Shafi'i madhab in that light blue. In the light blue, you could see, and by the way, you could see that the spread, you want to keep in mind, how did these spread, and why in one corner, because the distribution and the movement, the madhahib, they spread either by a certain government embracing a specific madhab to become that canonized constitution, just like al-Hanafi madhab. It was really the Uthmani Khilafah. It was the one that embraced the Hanafi madhab to be the constitution, the law that they would judge based on, and that's why the Hanafi madhab tends to be the most expansive. And the Maliki madhab, it was pretty much Asad ibn al-Furat was considered the most important figure, and also Sahnun, the most important 2 figures that spread al-Maliki madhab in those areas. Al-Madhab al-Shafi'i spread pretty much, from Somalia and Yemen. Yemen and Somalia, those were the most important 2 places. From Somalia, Yemen, Djibouti, and those areas were the most important places that later started teaching Islam. So when you look at Indonesia and Malaysia, they actually learned Islam through the Muslims here. Those were merchants that were traveling to different parts of the world to teach Islam. And of course, to teach Islam, you needed to teach the madhab that at least you know. So later, those scholars were the most important scholars to spread from Yemen all the way to Indonesia, Malaysia. They were merchants. Most of them were businessmen that were teaching Islam and al-madhab al-Shafi'i to those areas, and that's why you could see al-madhab al-Shafi'i pretty much going farther that way. Al-madhab al-Hanbali, very important. Of course, you could see that it's pretty much within Saudi, within the Gulf. You got some, in Hanbali, pretty much Kuwait and Saudi and UAE in some parts, and etc. You got all those were pretty much Hanbali madhab. And the most important reason why they're Hanbali madhab right now was really because of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, which right now is referred to as Wahhabism. It was really Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, and him embracing the Hanbali madhab was pretty much the main reason to why the Hanbali madhab is in this area. Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, 270, 80 years ago, 280 years ago almost, embraced the Hanbali madhab in order to face the different the different expansions that the Uthmani Khilafah at the time. The Uthmani Khilafah was embracing the Hanafi madhab and also Sufism. So in order to face that, the Uthmani Khilafah, he embraced the Hanbali madhab and started facing the Uthmani Khilafah, and was actually also going military in that. That's another story. Hanbali madhab is also, this is a very important thing to note, is that here they put it as Hanbali pretty much here, but a very important note to mention is that there is a lot of Hanbali madhab also in Syria. So you could see they didn't include Syria here, but in fact Syria was a very important place for the Hanbali madhab, which is where Ibn al-Qayyim and also Ibn Taymiyyah were in. So this is, needs some correction here, because Hanbali was also in Syria. Just another image, just to help us understand the madhahib and how they were expanding in different parts of the world. You could see there's Shafi'i in that blue, the dark blue. You could see Zaydi in this brown, the Zaydi, which is right now al-Huthiyin. You could see that Ibadi, which is right there. So this picture that you see in front of you is a lot more accurate than the previous picture. This is a lot more accurate. But, just to see, you got some Shafi'i right there, parts of al-Iraq and parts of al-Akrad, Kurdistan right there, and also Egypt. You could see that Shafi'i right there. You got some parts of Kenya, parts of different parts. You could see how it's spreading, and the different Shafi'is, and you could see right there Hanafi madhab pretty much. And the reason why you could see Hanafi madhab, although geographically speaking you could see that the Maliki madhab, in terms of its space, it definitely occupies more, but don't think that it is more, because this area is pretty much predominantly desert area. Just this area, you could see that the population is a lot more than this area. Okay, so don't look at the space expansion and look at the number of population. All right, let's see. Hanbali, the dark green, although here Hanafi in many ways. The red is other different other groups. This is really important to mention, because you do have other madhahib. So that's the question here. Are there other madhahib? Are there any other madhahib? There are other madhahib. Number one, al-Awza'i. There's the madhab al-Awza'i, who was born in 88 year Hijrah, and he died in Beirut, in Lebanon, and was a major scholar in hadith. His madhab actually vanished, and his madhab vanished because the students did not document that madhab, as we saw how Muhammad ibn al-Hasan al-Shaybani and how the other scholars, madhahib, Asad ibn al-Furat, documenting and recording the madhab for Asad ibn al-Furat for madhab Maliki. So al-Awza'i, those are really important to keep a note in, where his madhab, pretty much there's just a few information, a little bit of information left on al-madhab al-Awza'i, and that is because the students didn't document much of it. Sufyan al-Thawri was a scholar born 97 year Hijrah and died 161 year Hijrah, was living in al-Basra in Iraq, and was known for his great fiqh. But again, it also vanished because of the students not documenting. And Sufyan al-Thawri, at the end of his times, he was pretty much living incognito, hiding away because of the disagreements he had with the government, with the Abbasid government at the end of his time. Al-Layth ibn Sa'd, that's another madhab that we don't have all the details about. He was born in Egypt, died in 175 Hijriya. He was a great scholar, and in fact, he was even more scholarly than Imam Malik. One of my main shuyukh, his name is Dr. Muhammad Nafi'. He was a blind professor that taught me. His actually PhD dissertation was on al-Layth ibn Sa'd, and al-fiqh of al-Layth ibn Sa'd. Even though this professor was blind, but he got his PhD from al-Azhar on al-Layth ibn Sa'd and fiqh al-Layth ibn Sa'd. I don't know much about my professor. I'm sure he retired by now. He was old even at the time. Now, when we're talking about other madhab, we're talking about the madhab al-Zahiri. Al-madhab al-Zahiri is another madhab, and Dawood al-Zahiri lived between 200 and 270 year Hijrah, and in the beginning he was Shafi'i madhab, then he had his own madhab. Never used qiyas. We talked about that before, and he was always focused on the literal evidences, the literal text, the textual evidences, and the literal wordings of that madhab. Later, a very important scholar, now I want you to keep in mind that Ibn Hazm was not the direct student of Dawood al-Zahiri, but it was actually, because you could see it, Ibn Hazm died in 456 Hijrah. All right, and Dawood al-Zahiri died 270 year Hijrah. Ibn Hazm was considered the most important scholar to spread that madhab. Ibn Hazm was the most important scholar to spread the Zahiri madhab, and it's really important that that some scholars regarded that Ibn Hazm was not necessarily Zahiri, and when we say Zahiri, that pretty much means that he was depending on the literal verbatim of those texts, and not necessarily to dig deep in the metaphors or even the context of the different texts. So when you look at Ibn Hazm, many times, although many would attribute him to the Zahiri madhab, but in the actual research you will see that Ibn Hazm was not necessarily Zahiri, and that's what you see in his book. The most important book that he wrote is called Al-Muhalla. Ibn Hazm was one of my favorite scholars, just to keep that. Ibn Hazm was one of my most important and one of the most in my favorite scholars. Ibn Hazm, this man is really hard to understand. He lived in Al-Andalus. Okay, we're just going to talk about a little bit about Ibn Hazm. Keep that in mind. Ibn Hazm lived in Al-Andalus, and Ibn Hazm, in the beginning, he didn't really study Islam. In fact, He learned poetry, Arabic language. He learned all the different tools that wasn't really Islam. And the teachers that were teaching him were really the concubines that were in the castle that he was living in. Now, he was the son of a minister. So he happened, of a wazir, basically. So he happened to learn directly from the most important bondswomen, concubines that were the most educated. At the time, it was the concubines that were the most educated and not the free women. Why did they educate the concubines and not the free women? Because their price would go up. But the free women, they had all the different privileges, so they didn't consider that they needed education. So the ones that were educated were really the slaves. That was the common thing, is that slaves were educated in order to increase their price. So Ibn Hazm gets to learn and have special direct tutors that were teaching him. It wasn't until Ibn Hazm later goes to the masjid, didn't even know how to pray Tahiyyat al-Masjid, didn't even know how to pray right in a jama'ah. So that's when he was so embarrassed that he didn't know the basics about Islamic studies. So that's when, at a later age, that's when, he was so embarrassed, and that motivated him to learning Islam. Ibn Hazm later wrote books on Islam, on love and romance, and that book is one of a book. I don't know what to say about it, because that book, it's called Tawq al-Hamama. It was actually translated to more than, I believe, 7 languages. It's called Tawq al-Hamama fi al-Ulf wa al-Ta'aluf. Tawq al-Hamama, even though Ibn Hazm, the most important book that Ibn Hazm wrote, to the point that Ibn Hazm pretty much has his own madhab, really, is in the book called Al-Muhalla. Al-Muhalla, and it's a huge 8-volumed book. It's a huge brown copy 8-volume book. And Al-Muhalla, in his book, he's got all the different fatawa, in where he will even attack all the different scholars of fiqh, and will literally use very, very severe, let's just call his language severe, heavy loaded language against all the different madhab, except al-madhab al-Hanbali. The reason why he didn't attack al-madhab al-Hanbali is because he didn't regard it as a fiqh madhab. He didn't regard it as a fiqh madhab during his time. It wasn't even a fiqh madhab. It was more of a hadith, the school, than a madhab. And Ibn Hazm, in his book Tawq al-Hamama, Tawq al-Hamama means the lace of a pigeon, and he talks about the different ways of how romance and how specifically love was causing the fitna, and it causing delusion into within the society in Al-Andalus. Although that's what he aimed from the book, but that's not really what happened. If you read the book, you're like, okay, how did you get to the goal in speaking about the book? In the book is full of poetry. It speaks about romance and love and all those different things, but then the object of the book was really to caution people from the romance and love, and how it can imprison somebody's heart away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That was the goal of the book. Ibn Jarir al-Tabari is another madhab, but like I said, not much is known about madhab al-Tabari. And Ibn Jarir al-Tabari, he died in 310 Hijriya, studied from Shafi'i and studied also Hanafi madhab. He actually later had his own madhab, but then, like I said, not much of it is known. So the question is, why do we have all these different opinions if they're going to go back to the same references? All right, now it's really important to keep in mind that all texts, all right, you've got the text. There are 2 sides to the text. there's one side to the text, which is the authenticity of that text, and there's the other side of the text in where the wording of the text. So the texts are either one is straightforward wording called qat'i dalala, or the wording that may take more than one meaning, which is very similar to homophones. All right, the wording may have more than one meaning, or sometimes that the lexicon used in it may not necessarily be very clear. So when something is qat'i dalala, asad means lion. There's no other meaning to it. But can the context tell me something else? That's where usually, when it's qat'i dalala, there's usually no differences of opinions. When it's dhanni dalala, meaning that the wording may take more than one interpretation, that's when you are going to have differences of opinions between scholars. Does that mean I'm not going to have differences of opinions between scholars when something is qat'i dalala? No, you can have more than one opinion, even if something is a straightforward wording. So how can a straightforward wording actually have differences of opinions? Number one, the context. Sometimes they can have different contexts. For example, let's look at the hadith. This hadith, لا يفلح قوم ولوا أمرهم امرأة. That if we look at the wording literally says, no group assigns a woman as their authority shall be successful. This is what the wording says. All right? So you had other scholars that derived from this text and said, well, therefore, no woman can be in any position of leadership, period. Other scholars, they said, no, there is a context to why the Prophet ﷺ said this. The context is that the king of Persia had died, and his era, the person that was going to lead after him, was his own daughter. So the Prophet ﷺ was saying that in other words here, the Qawm, they regarded that this was referring to the leader of Persia, which at the time was a woman. And later, that woman was actually the last leader in Persia, and the kingdom of Persia, the monarchy and the kingdom of Persia was totally dissolved, and that was the end of Persia. So some scholars said that, well, look at the context, and even though the wording is straightforward, but they said no, this is referring to a specific context. Other scholars will say, no, it's not just the context, but there's also where there's a general leadership and there's a specific leadership. So can a woman be a CEO over a company? Well, they said, well, some scholars said that no, she can't be, because of the hadith that لا يفلح قوم ولوا أمرهم امرأة. Any woman that is leading anything, they will not be successful, period. Other scholars said, well, wait a minute, لا يفلح قوم, based on the context, that this is talking about the major leadership, which is things like khilafah, things like presidency, that she can't rule in those areas and not in al-walaya al-amma or walaya al-khassa. They distinguish between walaya amma and walaya khassa. Walaya amma to mean an ultimate ruling, such as presidency or khilafah. But wilaya khassa would be, specific. It's a wilaya khassa. She's probably a leader. She's probably a CEO over a company. She's probably a minister. She's probably a wazir, probably a treasurer in the government, or probably maybe prime minister. So she's not necessarily the king, but she's the prime minister, and they went into details about that. The other part, even though the wording is clear, but the chronology, they might have differences of opinions because of the chronology. So what does that mean? That they'll look at, which text was mentioned first. They'll have two straightforward texts, but sometimes the chronology, because the later text would abrogate the previous text. And having that being said, then they might have differences of opinions on which text came first. Other other things is where the authenticity of a text. We might have differences of opinions on the authenticity. Let's take an example, the issue of covering the face. Why would they have differences of opinions when the hadith is clear? The authenticity of the text. Well, doesn't the hadith actually say, O Asma, when a woman reaches the age of puberty, nothing shall appear from her except her face and her hands. So somebody might say, well, here it is. I mean, how straightforward is that? But here's the story, is that there is an objection that other scholars will object to this hadith and say, well, there is a figure in that particular narration. His name is Khalid ibn Duraik. They'll say, well, look, Khalid ibn Duraik, this person is his riwayah or his narration from Shamiyin or from from specific scholars, whether it's in the Sham or whether Iraq, that it's not acceptable, or at least it not necessarily not acceptable, but it's not authentic. So now you could see that abrogation, which comes first, etc., even if the wording is clear. So what if the wording is not clear? What was going to be the situation like? And when you look at that, and we're going to look at other topics next week, because this is supposed to be the end of the class for today, and look at the other topics, inshallah, and we will be speaking about are we obligated to follow a specific madhab? We'll talk about that next week, and other questions, taqleed and ifta. Taqleed and istifta. So how do I ask a question? Do I necessarily have to follow a certain madhab? What if my parents are Hanafi madhab and I would like to follow a Shafi'i madhab? Do I have to speak about every single time I want to ask about a fatwa? I have to say, well, I need a Shafi'i madhab relating this matter. I need a Hanafi madhab. I need this madhab, etc. Or what do I do in those situations? Other things, for example, what is the difference between a fatwa and a madhab and a cult and a Muslim sect and all those different things? This, inshallah, we'll talk about next week. And if anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to answer the questions, inshallah. And even the people on Facebook, if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer the questions. All right, I guess no question was put forward, and we'll continue next week, inshallah. And assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.